in the field of disabilities now for pretty soon 24 years. My first 20 years was with the Department of Health and Human Services with the Division of Services for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I am a licensed certified sign language interpreter. That's what I was before I became involved with the ADA portion of disabilities. With DOT, I'm responsible for the whole of NCDOT, everything that has anything to do with a disability, I'm responsible for at NCDOT. I'll let Ashley introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her.
Good morning. Good morning. I'll take it. My name is Ashley Council. I've spoken to a lot of you, and I've enjoyed speaking to each and every one of you. You may not have had the same experience, so now you know what the voodoo dolls need to look like. It is great to finally meet all of you in person. I've been with the North Carolina Department of Transportation since June 2018, so I'm kind of new to this too. Prior to that, I still am, an attorney admitted to the bar in the state of North Carolina. I practiced private practice for 17 years with an emphasis on general practice and criminal defense law. I do have some ADA experience with some of that trial practice, so you know I wasn't coming into it too cold. But I have enjoyed learning this along with you guys, and so when I don't know the answer to a question, I will find it for you when you give me a call. And again, thank you guys so much for coming. And please, any questions you have, this is why we're here. We really want you to understand what this is about. And so if you have anything, somebody else wants to ask, so don't be afraid to speak up.
I wanted to just start off with a little bit of background so that you'll understand if you haven't talked to Ashley already or haven't talked to someone in our office or me, that you understand where we're coming from. I'm imagining that most of you got a letter, a survey, a questionnaire a few months ago, and that started this whole process and probably caused a lot of uproar in your offices. I'm hoping that's not the case, but it may have. Basically, NCDOT is responsible, just like you as a municipality or whatever entity you are, is responsible for making sure that we do not discriminate against people with disabilities. So we were, back in 2015 when I started, responsible for implementing our own self-evaluation and transition plan. So I went through this very same process that you all are having to face now. So with that, after that, with that process, is this. This is NCDOT's self-evaluation and transition plan. I hold it this way so you can see how big it is. The first 30 pages approximately are the self-evaluation and transition plan. This is our inventory of facilities, our inventory of curb ramps, all of those inventories. That's what this is. So through the process of doing this self-evaluation and this transition plan, we were made aware by the Federal Highway Administration that we are also responsible to make sure that anyone that's a subrecipient of funds through NCDOT, we need to make sure that they are not discriminating against people with disabilities. So in that process of trying to figure out the best way to do that, they helped us understand that one of the ways is to ensure that every municipality that is a subrecipient, and basically almost every municipality in the state is a subrecipient of funds, federal funds, state funds through NCDOT, is also responsible to have done a self-evaluation and a transition plan. So in the process of trying to figure out how best to determine which municipalities to work with, to help, we decided to do that survey. Back in 2015, we did an original survey. The regulations say that a municipality has to have 50 employees to be required to have the self-evaluation and transition plan. So when we did that original survey back in 2015, we sent it out to about 20 municipalities. At that point in time, we were thinking, you know, a municipality probably has to have about 40,000 in population to have 50 employees. Well, we eventually found out that that was way off. So this most recent survey that most of you got, I'm assuming, is as a result of realizing that we could go down to about 2,000 people in population size to be required to have a transition plan. So that's why the majority of you got. We sent out I believe 230, 39. Does that include the original 20?
Oh, yeah. it does.
So about 240 was the size of this last survey that went out. So what we're trying to do now is to determine through that survey who has a transition plan, who had already done the evaluation, who did all of that, so that we can come out and just review it to make sure you've got everything that you need to have in place. And for those that don't have one, what we can do to help you get there. Question? We will. That'll be part of the presentation. I'm just trying to get some preliminary information out there, then we'll get into the presentation. So once that survey went out, we started getting all of these questions. A lot of you called. We're calling Amy. We're calling anybody that you could to get some information. And we understand that. It's a daunting task to recognize that you have to go through this process. It's not something that's a new requirement. This requirement has been on the books since the early 90s. So I think what I want you to understand is that we're not here as the compliance arm of DOT. We're not here to hit you over the head with a club to say, you've got to do this. We are here to help you. That's all I want to do. We want to make sure that you have everything you need to have in place to be prepared in case something happens. That's all we're trying to do. We're trying to give you the tools. We're trying to give you the information that you need so that you can go through this process, hopefully, and not have as difficult a time as I had back in 2015 when I started with DOT and had to go through this process. What I wanted to do first is to try and understand why you're here. Well, this is sensitive. Okay. So we had this discussion how we were going to do introductions in the room. We were thinking 75 people, 15 seconds a person. That's a good chunk of time. So let me first ask, how many of you are not here representing a city or a municipality? Anybody not representing a city or municipality? Okay. I'm sorry? Okay. Anybody else? So everybody else is representing a city or municipality. Okay. Start. What cities? And I'm not asking this for any reason. I'm just trying to get a feel for where you're from and what your situation is. What cities? Hickory. Dallas. Bessemer City. Maiden. Hendersonville, Morganton. Laurinburg, Belmont. Gastonia. Mebane. Jacksonville. Yadkinville. Wadesboro. Cherryville? Cherville. I'm born and raised North Carolina, okay. Greensboro. Anybody, any other cities? Greensboro? Moxville. Granite Falls. Hillsboro. Y'all came a long way, some of you, okay. Lexington. Okay. Kannapolis. Okay. So how many of you are your city's ADA coordinator? Raise your hand. I see about 5 hands. How many of you are in HR? How many of you are in safety or risk management? That may be part of HR. What other areas? City managers? Anybody a city manager?
City clerk.
City clerk. Sorry? Sorry.
Attorney.
Attorneys, okay. Engineering. We've got a plethora of types of people here. Okay. This will be interesting. Okay. So what do you want? What are you expecting from today? What I want to do is to write some of these things down so that we make sure we cover everything that you need. And if you yell something out right now that's not going to be something that I cover, I'm going to tell you so you can make the decision to leave or not. What was the first one? What to implement? I'm missing that first one. Money. Well, I will tell you, we will. That is not something that we will get into. Ashley may have. Ashley's done a lot of research since she's been here, so I don't know if you have a couple of resources that she may be able to give you to look for monies. But that's not something that we're going to spend a whole lot of time on. Just FYI. Time frame. What else?
Does this really apply to us?
Okay.
Sample or template?
Expert resources, not just websites and things like that. That people look at. Ask the nitty-gritty questions.
Okay.
Well,
You don't need to worry about being able to read my writing. It's just for me and Ashley.
how can I sign this too?
What's your position?
Town manager.
You can probably assign it to anybody you want to.
I think I better get somebody cake.
Anything else?
How it came down to DOT.
Anything else?
About penalties.
Penalties? Content. Okay.
Communications to state has had, any communications to state has had a federal level on this, that's typically sure expensive.
Okay.
Is there any difference between the DOT plan and what municipalities would have to do?
Okay. I can tell you no, real quick. Well, I won't even write that up.
Why now? I mean, if transition plans were supposed to be in place in 92, 93, are we not bringing something to life that we maybe let sleep?
Okay, I wrote why now up there. If we don't answer that question throughout the day, remember to ask us at the end and we'll make sure that we cover that part of it.
So I'm looking for information about updating.
Okay. All right, anything else?
What level of detail do we need to get into? About a deadline.
I think we had deadline earlier.
Time frame.
Yeah, time frame. Okay,
Many of us probably know this already, we don't have it documented, right?
probably.
Because of things.
Okay.
So why are we, again, why are we bringing the dead horse up?
Okay. Anything else?
Is there an annual report required?
Okay.
I'm gonna piggyback off of that, so once we get the plan in place, of course, that's the implementation, then going forward, how to update
Okay.
someone else that might come back behind us.
Yep.
15 or 20 years.
Exactly.
That's gonna go up there already, but accessibility, like who do you have to turn into? I know you have probably have to have it on your website, but you have to turn into you as well.
Okay. When I do a presentation or a training like this, for me, it's not about me standing up here presenting the whole time. This is going to be an interactive process because you'll get bored real quick and fall asleep real quick listening to this voice. So for both Ashley and I, we expect this next 3 hours or 3.5 hours, however long it's going to be, to really be interactive. So this is a starting point. I wanted to make sure that we all were on the same page in terms of why we're here. So we'll make sure that we answer all of these questions. If we don't, by the end of the day, just remind us of anything that we haven't covered that's up here. I think the majority of this is going to come up in our presentation. So I don't think we'll have to worry about making sure we cover something that's not up here. Any other thing?
What level of, how much money would a municipality expect to get the transition plan?
I hate to keep saying this to you directly, but we're not going to have that answer. I don't have a clue.
It's totally case specific.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's going to depend. I mean, for NCDOT, I know at one point, well, I don't know anything about the cost to actually do the transition plan or the self-evaluation component of it. I have an idea of what it was going to cost to upgrade everything once we found the deficiencies, but to actually do to go through the process itself, I have no idea. Now, I know that, and we'll talk about this as we get into it, there are consulting companies out there that will come in and do it for you. And I've heard those costs range from $5,000 to $200,000. So it again, like Ashley said, it's really going to be case specific in terms of what you've got in your municipality, the number of sidewalks they have to inventory, you know, all of those types of things it's going to be very specific. Okay. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley. Ashley's going to start off by talking about the self-evaluation, and then we'll go through the rest of the day.
I'll let you deal with that. I already can tell.
And if you can't, I think Amy explained that we're going to be staying over here on this side. I was able to make eye contact with everybody over here. So if you don't hear either one of us, I think both of our voices will carry just fine. Just please make this interactive. Don't let us stand up here and talk the whole time. We're not going to let you let us stand up here and talk the whole time. So.
Oh, no, I will use the Socratic method. Just quick housekeeping matters. If anyone has any difficulty seeing what's up here, if you find throughout the presentation that you're just having trouble, we do have some hard copy printed here. And if you just want to let me know, I'll be more than happy to get that for you. Also, again, if you can't hear me, which I would find extremely difficult, but if you can't hear me, please let me know. Again, I want this to be as fully informative for you as possible. And not forgetting about this side of the room, but we do have to stand over here for filming. Also, I'm a fast talker. That's probably should have been an auctioneer. My first jury trial, I was arguing to a jury and the judge passed me a note and I thought, well, excuse me. And it said, for God's sake, slow down. So I'm aware of that. I make every effort to control that, but if and Mark's even holding, he's got the clicker here, so he's like going to slow me down. So, but if I get going too fast, it's not on purpose. Please let me know. So I guess we will get started with our slide. This is adherence to Title II is required of all entities, not just municipalities with 50 or more employees. There are more things required of municipalities with 50 or more employees when it comes to Title II. But all municipalities must adhere to the constitutional requirements and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The first one was enacted, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. US DOT implementing regulations, that's 49 CFR section 27 for the attorneys in the room. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I find I've dealt with more since I've been here, was enacted in 1990 by President George H.W. Bush. What I have found is that the ADA was enacted, and any municipality at that time who had 50 or more employees was made aware of the act. They immediately did what they were supposed to according to the statutory requirements, and then they pretty much set it and forget it. And it is a living document. It is required to be updated because towns grow. They add streets, they add facilities, they add amenities, and all of those amenities and all of those facilities and all of those streets have to be accessible for all of its citizens. So that is one instance I've seen. I've seen perfect looking transition plans that if they had been kept up with would have been fine, but now they're 15 to 20 years old and pretty much obsolete. Another instance I have found is that when this was enacted in 1990, North Carolina is a very fast growing state, especially recently. Mark and I were talking on the way up here about just how the towns are just exploding, basically, and you all know that. You're dealing with it on the base level. So in 1990, your town may not have had anywhere near 50 employees. You may not have had any idea about this other than you needed to follow, Title II, but not necessarily do a self-evaluation and ADA transition plan. But then as time went on, you grew just like everybody else in North Carolina, and at 50 employees, and you magically came under the requirements. But it was set and forget, so you just didn't know. And now we're coming back to it. The federal government has reminded us that it is an issue. It is something we need to keep up with. And we're having to make sure everybody gets on the same page. So that's basically the two situations I've seen. Now, of course, I've also seen municipalities who did it right when they were supposed to and kept up right when they were supposed to. So it goes across the board. But that's basically been my experience. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned
Buildings. Yes, sir.
buildings. Where it's impractical, can you still do accommodation?
Where it's I'm repeating for the video. Your question is where it is impractical, can you still do accommodations? I have dealt with that actually very recently. There have been a couple of towns with specific questions with regard to historical landmark sites, whether they have to be accessible. I'm going to give you, we'll come back. I'm not going to get rid of your pretty writing. I'm going to give you a website, and the website also has the contact phone number. This website is critical.
And I made no plans to look at it again.
Okay. www.access-board.org. These people know everything. There's not a question you can ask that they don't already know the answer to, but they will certainly look it up. I called the gentleman with Access Board about this, about a historical significance issue, and he filled me right in. I was able to get him hooked up with the municipality. So and again, every situation is case specific. So what I would recommend you do is to call these folks, and they will help you out. All we can do is that you do your due diligence. That's all we can ask. And this is your due diligence. Yes, sir.
Is it accessboard.gov?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Accessboard.gov. There's also ADA.gov. I find that they're good for just the quick little check questions, but if you have really in-depth issues and need to talk to a human being, I really recommend Access Board.
I know.
have a question on, before we leave that first line there, 50 plus employees situation. What's the definition?
Stay tuned.
And if I could, before we move on to that, I meant to say something when I was up a little bit earlier. We're not here to pretend like we're the experts. We can't tell you what about a curb ramp you need to measure. I can give you a few points that I know need to be measured, but I can't tell you. I'm not an engineer. That's not my job, and I'm not going to pretend like it's my job. These are the people that are the experts. These are the people that know exactly what in a building you need to assess, what in a curb ramp. They know what is required, the specific requirements of the assessment that you need to do. So I want to make sure that we don't mislead you into thinking that we're the experts. Now, where I will say that we have a lot of knowledge is this process, what the process is and how you can get through this process to end up with a good product, a good self-evaluation and transition plan. Okay. And again, it's due diligence, and this is who we use. I mean, I
I have worn these guys out, Colin, and that's a very good question. I mean, a lot of you do this. North Carolina is an old state. It's a tourist-driven industry as well. We have a lot of, old buildings and stuff. What do we have to do to, do we have to, fundamentally alter something to comply? Well, again, case-by-case situations, they're the best. Now, as far as this question, who does the self-evaluation and transition requirement apply to? Municipalities with 50 or more employees. And the definition is a broad one. Any employee who receives any kind of compensation or benefit is counted toward the unit of government. Temporary employees count. If they get a check during the fiscal year, they count. Your county commissioners who get paid per diems or whatever, it counts. It is an extremely broad definition. So a lot of folks have been very surprised that they qualify under this requirement. Are there any questions?
Let me add one thing to this. Even though this is the requirement for an official self-evaluation and transition plan, aside from that requirement, there is a requirement, even if you don't have 50 employees, that you still have to have some sort of accessibility plan, ADA accessibility plan. That is in the regulation as well. That's not necessarily something, if if we determine that you don't have 50 employees, we will probably not work with you in terms of coming out to do review. If at some point we get caught up with all 200 and however many that we have to do, we may work with you on that. Or if you need assistance getting through that, we will certainly give you the assistance. But I don't want you to think that, okay, I'm going to go back and hire a couple people, so I end up with 48 employees and not 50.
There's been some try. They've tried.
Because that's not going to negate your responsibility in having some sort of plan that shows you have a process in place to make your city accessible to people with disabilities.
Yes.
When does that count? You count it by the month, or you count it per year? When do you do that count?
Typically say fiscal year if you want to say.
Yeah, I would say throughout the fiscal year at any point if you have 50 employees.
Anytime you bump over 50.
Yes. Because at that time, if something should happen, God forbid, and you had 50 employees at that time, and you don't have the documentation to show that you did your due diligence, you've got a situation.
We want to, I was hoping we'd get through this without sort of broaching this subject, but we want to make sure that if at any point down the road, there are organizations out there that come into cities that specifically look for issues. So we want to make sure that you have in place what you need to have in place to protect yourself. That's the bottom line. We want to make sure that you have gone through some sort of assessment, that you have looked at everything in your city and have a record of it, and at least a plan to move forward. That's all we're hoping to get you through. If we can get you to that point, if at some reason down the road, for some reason, you find yourself before a judge or before some other body trying to defend yourself, you have something that you can defend yourself with. If you have 49 employees today, but 3 years ago you had 50 employees, they're probably going to want you to have had a transition plan, is what I'm going to think. So if you're close enough to have to finagle back and forth whether you've got 50 employees, I would say you probably need to go ahead and try and get this done if you can. We're here to make sure that you have what we were required to have so that we didn't have any problems. We want to make sure that if you run into problems down the road, that you have something in place. And that's not the ultimate reason that we're here. It's one of the reasons, but the ultimate reason that we're here, I have 2 parents that were disabled. And I don't want my parent to come into your city and not be able to get around. I want everybody to have the same access to services, to facilities that everybody else has. So that's the other part of this. It's bottom line simple, just making sure that you're accessible. Okay.
One question. Steve asked a question about accommodation. Is that part of this plan as to how you're going to address the accommodation or the facilities required for access?
The question is, how do we address, as part of the transition plan?
Accommodation versus physical facilities.
Yes, sir, like, just to make sure I'm understanding, having braille copies of things, having sign language interpreters available, yes, sir.
Travel, access, and so forth.
Yes, it's a broad, the transition plan does not just deal with, what you would think a DOT situation would deal with. It's a comprehensive look at the entire municipality situation, their entire situation. So yes, there's issues with it's escaping me what the term is, but having interpreters available and
Effective communication.
Effective communication, yes.
The one thing that I would add, you asked specifically about travel. If I'm going to call it anything, I guess I'll call it a gray area. And it is really not a gray area. It's just a separation of duties. When we go into, especially a larger city, if you have a transit system, transits have their own reviews through Federal Transit Administration. I think that's what the last part is. So they have their own responsibilities in terms of ADA, and theirs are completely different. So we don't, typically when we go in to look at these reviews, we don't even look at transit systems. The only part of a transit system that we'll look at are the sidewalks for bus stops, or the bus stop itself, to make sure that you've got them as part of your inventory. But in terms of looking at the actual transit system, making sure that the buses are accessible and all of that, that's actually a completely separate review that we know takes place, and on a very regular basis. So we don't even concern ourselves with that part of the ADA accessibility.
Well, I'm taking up too much time.
No.
The question is a museum. One of my clients has a museum. It's an old building.
Yes.
So what do you do? How do you look at it?
Well, it does fall, if it is a part of the municipality, if it is a facility of the municipality, it does fall under the requirement for a self-evaluation and inclusion in the inventory, which would ultimately go into the transition plan. And again, as far as if it's an old building or if it's something that might require, a catastrophic change, again, a case-by-case specific situation, I would definitely recommend accessboard.gov. Okay. Did that answer your question? I'm sorry, I'm sorry.
How do we look at a museum, say, for instance, that's got multiple floors?
Yeah, you're talking about very specific, and that's what this group does. We don't have that expertise.
Yes.
I mean, we're not going to be able to tell you that the signage on the elevator, the sign for the elevator has to be 48 inches up off the ground. I mean, we have resources that we can send you. We have that very thing that she's holding up. Actually, Donna, if I can just, this is, and we didn't bring any of these with us, did we? This is what we use for our facilities. We have this electronically. I think we even have it in a fillable form that we would be glad to share with you. This was done out of an organization in the northeastern part of the country. But this tells you everything that you need to look for in any facility that you have. It is called the ADA checklist for existing facilities.
Is that available online?
It is. And we have, like I said, we have it electronically. Anybody that wishes to have it, I don't know what the easiest way to get it out, but if you want to email Ashley, most of you have had contacts with Ashley. We'd be glad to send it to you.
Feel free to call me. I will get it to you the second I get back in the office. In fact, if you just want to let me know at the break, I'll put you down and I will get it to you. Because those are the specifications. And when we come in, when we come to make sure everything is, as it needs to be, I'm not coming with a measuring tape. I'm just making sure that you use the appropriate guidelines, which we will get to. I don't want to get ahead of myself. But the key, the purpose and scope of self-evaluation is to identify barriers in programs and activities that prevent persons with disabilities from access, and includes an evaluation of policies and practices. So again, it's a communications issue, it's an access issue, it's everything. The key is to provide equivalent access to the maximum extent feasible. And that's what we're looking at, you know, historic buildings. What do we have to do to the maximum extent feasible? That's the guideline we use. And that's the guideline that Access Board can help get you to with due diligence. Are there any questions on that? Okay. So as far as doing your evaluation, what do you guys think should be evaluated? Curb ramps? Curb cuts, yes, sir.
Pedestrian walkways, facilities.
Yes, sir.
Pretty much everything.
Yes, sir. And when you say facilities, what specifically?
City-owned or municipality-owned buildings, libraries,
Restrooms.
Right,
parks, there's
exactly. Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Is there anything?
I've got too many questions.
No,
No, that's why we're here.
I mean, as I understand it, anything existing prior to 1992 is exempt. No?
No, sir.
There, and again, we'll refer back to the Access Board. There are all sorts of rules and stipulations. If a building has had any type of renovations done to it, as soon as you touch a building, it then falls under current code.
I understand that. But if it has,
You'll have to, we're not going to pretend to answer your question because I'm not going to take that. Number one, I don't want to take the responsibility for answering it wrong if I do. So these are the people really that can use that expertise.
Any other?
How come, once you get off the DOT, we're getting this, we're having to do this, requiring federal money to get off the DOT. Once you get out of DOT's right of way or whatever, how come you have to do this? How do you get over right? How is DOT requiring municipalities to do this as you get out of the right of way?
How is the question is, how is the DOT requiring this? Essentially what you feel is outside their jurisdiction. Well, it's basically our mandate from the Federal Highway Administration and also the Department of Justice, I believe, that we've just been tagged to be the person, to be the department, to make sure that everyone's in compliance.
Basically, our responsibility as recipients of federal funds is that we have to make sure that anyone that receives those pass-through funds, and again, it's not just limited to federal funds, any subrecipient, anybody that receives money from NCDOT, we have a responsibility to make sure that you are not discriminating against someone with a disability. And that goes beyond our right of way. It goes beyond anything that we have jurisdiction over specifically. We are simply following through on our responsibility to make sure that you are not discriminating against someone with a disability. So for example, if you have a Parks and Rec center that has 50 stairs to get to and has no ramp or no other accessibility port for a person in a wheelchair, that's discrimination. So we are there to make sure that you're not doing that type of discrimination. And the best way for us to do that is to make sure that you have gone through this process of evaluating your municipality and setting up this transition plan on how to make yourselves accessible.
During the transition plan period back in the early 90s, I think they wanted you to identify or do the self-assessments, but they never really set a deadline to complete all those assessments. Is that correct? And is that still where we're at? Are we identifying what our accessibility issues are? And do we need to have those completed in a certain time frame, or our previous jurisdiction I work for, we used to get sued pretty regularly for ADA non-compliance, and a lot of times the issues were mediated, you know, where we agreed to fix what the issue was. Are they still handling that way, or you just want us to have a plan? You're not saying we have to have this stuff. We got to identify our issues. We just don't have to have it fixed. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's basically, we want you to
Well,
identify.
that's what I'm saying. Plan to fix, but it doesn't say when that plan has to be.
Okay, let me go back to your first question was there a deadline? There really was no deadline, is what I think I heard you say, and that's not true. There was a deadline. I don't have the date in my mind. It was like 1992 or 6 or somewhere in there. And I know that there was a deadline. Everybody had to have gone through this process and established a plan. I don't know if there was ever a deadline. I want to say that there was a deadline. Yes.
That non-structural parts were due to be done within 3 years of the ADA's passing.
Yes.
Everything non-structural. But to me, people that I dealt with, there was a lot of controversy over what was really non-structural.
So the regulation, I mean, as you know, some things can be kind of worded in a way that it appears to be vague, but I do know now, I will not say that my memory serves me well right now and I have the dates, but as Donna said, there are deadlines, there were deadlines in place, those deadlines have passed. That's long ago, that's 20 plus years ago. So we are all way beyond those deadlines. And the deadline was not only to have done the self-evaluation, but was to identify how you're going to fix the things that you found that were deficient and within a certain period of time to have had those things fixed. Now, the second part of your question was mediation for any issues that come up currently. And then are we only required to have a plan, not really follow through with it? There is a part of the regulation that says that you're to keep the transition plan updated, that you're to follow through with it. My only response to that would be if somebody comes and, files a lawsuit and you end up in court and it's been 15 years since you did your transition plan and you've not accomplished anything on that transition plan, that's what would be looked at, I would think.
I have seen, the municipalities typically order what needs to be fixed as per need. I mean, on a need basis. So there's priority issues, there's intermediate issues, and then there's, okay, we'll get to that as soon as we can. And so they have a, 5 to 10 year schedule. It's what I've typically seen to have everything resolved, because it costs money. I mean, I know. But there are issues that really do need immediate attention. And so as long as you can put those in some sort of, order on a need basis, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say that that's acceptable.
Has anybody experienced a DOJ visit or okay, so we've got a few cities that have. So for those of you that have raised your hands, for the rest of you, if you want to talk to those people, I'm sure they'll be glad to tell you their experience and share how they were able to go through that process and what came out of it.
What was your question?
If anybody had a visit from the DOJ, the Department of Justice, regarding ADA accessibility.
I may be getting ahead, and I understand the need that we got to do this. So my question is, as we build new buildings in our municipality and modify new buildings, we utilize the North Carolina accessibility code within the building code. Is it different from the federal regs, or can we depend on the building code in North Carolina to be in line with where we need to be? Y'all are smiling, so that makes me real nervous.
Actually, the only reason I'm smiling is because I just had to face this myself for DOT.
Yeah.
And what we found out that the building code, in most cases, now there are a couple of instances, and I want to say it had something to do with restrooms. I'd have to get that clarification again. I can't remember off the top of my head. Whatever it was I was looking at the time is covered by the North Carolina building codes. And what I was told by the expert at the Department of Insurance who does the building codes, is that North Carolina building codes are more strict in most cases than the regulations that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. So for the most part, you're covered if you're looking at building code, but don't assume that covers you for everything.
I'm so sorry. What was that now?
Even for a brand new facility, you still are required to do self-assessment.
Yes, ma'am, because that will ultimately, again, the transition plan, the inventory is a living document that as your municipality grows, your document grows with it. So you need to include that, yes.
And one other reason, I'm hoping the video camera will pick me up if I stand in this side of the table. One of the other reasons that we found is building code inspectors who go out and inspect new buildings don't look at every little piece of ADA requirement that's out there. They're not going to measure the signs off the floor. They're not going to measure the towel bar and that. I mean, they're just not going to do all of that. So just having built a new building doesn't guarantee that everything in that building meets the requirements. You probably talked about a lot of this.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here thinking, well, let's see. So again, just real quick, critical areas to evaluate when you are doing your self-evaluation for your municipality. Vertical facilities, for which your municipality is responsible. That includes public right-of-way, accessing government offices, any medical facilities that might be under the municipality's control, downtown core areas, school zones, residential areas, parks, shared use trails, access to public buildings, obviously, permit licensing offices, public meeting rooms, and that type of thing. So these are the vertical facilities. Are there? And of course, I mean, including but not limited to, you know, whatever your municipality may have that I'm not covering. Any questions on that? Okay. And then we get to the second part. The first part of your self-evaluation is the vertical facilities. The second part is pedestrian facilities for which your municipality is responsible. And I know that has been a question. I mean, you know, the DOT does have has sidewalks or takes care of roads in my, you know, in my municipality. Am I responsible for those? The DOT is responsible for what's in their purview. You're responsible for what's in yours. And that includes curb ramps, sidewalks, pedestrian crossings, pedestrian signals, shared use trails, parking lots, bus stops, and anything else that may fall within your municipality's jurisdiction. Any questions on that? Okay. So these are some of the things, just by way of example. These are some of the things we're going to be, you know, you should look for in your evaluation. On the right here is code appropriate curb ramp. And on the left, we have one that's not. Can you point out the problems here with what we have on the left? I'm sorry? No detectable warning, yes. Anything else?
That one you don't have access to if it's a four-way.
Yes. Is that? What about this grate down here? Would that be a problem for a person with a cane, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah. Is it flush to the road?
No.
Okay. And what about the truncated cone caps there on the code one? There's a lot of issues. So that's the kind of thing, you know, you're looking at as far as trying to get things Title II compliant. Are there any questions? Now, while you're conducting the evaluation, you'll be looking at this is something I've come up with too. Come up against too. People are trying to decide, you know, whether to use staff resources within their government or obtain a private consultant. I can't really help you with that. It really truly is a case-specific situation. Some municipalities just don't have the funds to hire a private consultant and have to use what's available already. Some bigger cities have situations where they have so much property, like Charlotte or Winston-Salem, or, you know, some of these bigger municipalities, that it's a lot easier, more cost-effective to hire a private consultant to, you know, to do a self-evaluation. Although I've seen some small municipalities hire private consultants, it really is, you know, your government's situation. So that, you know, it's kind of up to you guys. But have you got any questions about that? Okay. So what are you looking for as your end result in the self-evaluation? You want to have an inventory of all your facilities, vertical and pedestrian, including details of modifications needed to make the facilities accessible. You know, we got to get the curb ramp flush, you know, Elm and Third or whatever. to make it accessible to persons with disabilities. You need a foundation. Your self-evaluation is your foundation for your transition plan. And you need to maintain it in a file available for the public. So a lot of folks put it online, but as long as somebody can walk into your municipality office and say, I'd like to see your self-evaluation, and you can hand it to them, that's the requirement.
Did you explain the foundation?
It's really, the question is, can I explain the foundation? And it's really just the basis for your transition plan. The inventory is the basis for just the creation of the document. Yes, ma'am.
Is there like a template that helps you get all this, or we literally just use for this slide?
Are you talking about an inventory
Yeah,
template?
so when you do the self-evaluation, like, is there a form that's fill out, you got 3 pages, make sure you're doing this, no?
Not really. I mean, there is the NCDOT, yeah, that you can use, yeah. Yes, and also, I will say, is that still in there? What's Salem and Jacksonville? Yeah, that's later.
Yeah, for the policy.
Okay. Yeah, there are some good templates. I mean, there's not really fill in the blank templates, because again, it's hard to do that, because again, it's such as, every municipality is so different with different holdings, with different needs. So it's hard to do an anticipatory kind of thing, but you can use go-bys. There are people out there who've done really good ones that you can use. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
On your self-evaluation, it's specific to facilities, but how about things like, is your website accessible? Are your policies and written job descriptions compliant? Is that pulled into this also?
You must have, we Wisnets have the same, that's the exact reason that I stood up, was to make sure. I want to, because we focus heavily on facilities, we talk about buildings, we talk about curbs, sidewalks, but there is the whole other side, and it was mentioned in a previous slide. You are responsible for looking at your policies, your services, that whole other side that's kind of the intangible side that doesn't have a concrete thing that you can look at. And that's going through any type of hiring policy that you have. And the only example I can come up with is if you had a hiring line where you listed your jobs in an audio form and people had to call in to listen to what was available. If that's all you had, then that wouldn't be accessible. So looking at those types of things, your job descriptions, all of those things are the services, the policies, and the procedures would be that whole other aspect that you need to look at when you're doing this evaluation as well.
Yes, sir.
On your evaluation plan for municipality, are municipalities required to inventory like sidewalks, curb ramps on DOT streets and DOT right of ways, or is it on city streets, city right of ways?
I was surprised that question hadn't come up before now. So yes, for those of you that are in that, you have that responsibility within your municipality. What do you know about the DOT right of way? Sorry? Well, that's true.
We'll post this
That's-
number at the end.
Say that louder.
They don't maintain sidewalks.
DOT does not maintain the sidewalk. That is the responsibility of the municipality. Now, what I will say is that when DOT comes through, does anything to a street, a DOT roadway, it is our responsibility to fix everything that's a problem. And they will look at a curb ramp when that happens. Now, I'm not going to sit here and guarantee you that it's going to happen every time that we do that. But that is the process that we have. We are supposed to, when we come through, whether it's resurfacing, whether it's construction, fixing something, whatever the case may be, we are supposed to look at everything about that roadway to make sure that everything is up to code.
Even the curb ramps, the DOT puts in.
Yes. When we come through, I'm sorry?
We have to evaluate that.
If yes, you do, because that's in your right of way. Now, okay, let me back up. So when we're talking about a DOT road, so in Raleigh, we've got Highway 70 that comes through, which is Glenwood Avenue. In our inventory, in this inventory, if you want to take the time, you'll find Highway 70 in Raleigh and all of the curb ramps in there in our inventory. So no, you would not have to inventory the curb ramps on DOT roads that come through your municipality. because we have already done it. Everybody get that? Is that news to anybody?
But in our case, in a lot of cases, because we have a lot of state-owned roads running through Greensboro, we hire the contractors. We're reimbursed, but the state never, I don't know that there's a state inspector that ever comes through and looks at this, just because we're contracted, we contract it out. So
Right.
our inspectors will look and go,
Well, I think and the question is, if you're a municipality and you have contractors that come in and do these inspections, is there a state contractor or a state inspector that also does the inspection? Basically, when we set out in 2015, and we are currently actually going through the process again to make it a GIS-based inventory, we are going through, and for those of you that know how DOT is structured, we have 14 highway divisions across the state, and each one of those highway divisions covers a certain number of counties. And each one of those highway divisions across the state currently is going through the process of inventorying any state maintained road and any curb and the curb ramps that are on that road. So if you, I'm not quite sure I'm following what you're saying, Donna, but if you bring in a contractor or a consultant to do the self-evaluation and they also inventory, then it's just doubly inventoried. It's excess work that you don't need.
them up because NCDOT typically does not come into Greensboro and do like Friendly Avenue.
Right.
We're responsible to do it, even though it's a state road and all of that. But
Okay. Yeah, that probably gets more localized agreements between the highway division and the city of Greensboro. I can get that answer for you.
So do you guys inventory the sidewalks?
No,
You do not.
We
Just
do.
the ramps.
just the ramp. Okay.
Yes, sir?
The city's traditionally put in the sidewalk along state maintained road, but the curbs are DOT. They're DOT maintenance. So
The curb itself, yes.
the curb itself,
So when we come through, when we build a new road, the question was, the city typically maintains the sidewalk, but DOT takes care of the curb. And that is a correct statement. The curb ramp, it goes between it's in the right of way. All of this, of course, is in the right of way, but the cities are charged with maintenance of the sidewalk. And the DOT, when they come through and put in a new road or do work on a road, they will make sure that curb ramp is either there, that exists, or that it's up to code.
This question, I guess, is more for Ashley. If you don't evaluate the DOT grants, and then something happens, what will be the legal responsibility of the city?
I'm not gonna, sorry. You've got your city attorney who I'm sure you can get to right there.
And as a consultant, I have to be overly protective of that and go ahead and evaluate it.
My recommendation, and the question is for the video is, if you're in a city and you don't look at a curb ramp that happens to be on a DOT state road and something happens and there's a lawsuit, I guess is basically what you're saying, what happens? My bottom line statement to you would be that you as your city, your roads department, whatever your department that handles those roads, should have a clear understanding with the local highway division as to what roads are our responsibility and what roads are your responsibility. I'm sure that's already there, that there's a clear understanding of that. If as a consultant you go in to do that work and you're not sure, then you need to make sure that that city is 100% sure whose responsibility that road is, because that will then say whose responsibility that curb ramp is.
So DOT already have the inventory, so we can rely on that?
Not at this time because it's in transition. It's a good template, it's a good go by, but as far as using it for comprehensive information, as far as determining what we're accepting responsibility for versus what you need to do, I do not recommend using that at this time.
And I'm not going to stand up here and disagree with Ashley, but I will say that this is our inventory. And like I said, about 400 pages of this is inventory.
Yeah.
And about, well, I think it's 600 pages of it's inventory, and about 400 of that 600 page inventory is curb ramps. So we have 85,000 curb ramps inventory in this book. So my guess would be that most likely the one curb ramp that you're thinking about is probably going to be in here.
Oh, yeah.
Now, my strong recommendation would be, because we have come to realize that we need to update this and get it in a better electronic form that we can update it better. You know, we may have come through that particular area with a resurfacing that is not going to be shown here. So there may have been changes to that curb ramp since this has been done. So that's what Ashley is talking about, the transition to a new, more GIS-based electronic type of inventory.
We could use that, but couldn't we also use our Powell bill as a reference to what is DOT maintained?
Sure.
What's maintained?
Definitely.
And the division offices should know that too.
Right. And the question is, not only the DOT inventory, but also the Powell bill maps that you have, and working with the local highway division. I would say that's probably your first line of defense, and your go-to for questions would be that local highway office.
Okay, so this is a part of both the self-evaluation and transition plan process that is really, really critical. In both processes, your self-evaluation and your creation of your transition plan, were interested parties allowed to provide comment and feedback during the self-evaluation transition plan process. The statutory requirement is that a public entity shall provide an opportunity to interested persons, including individuals with disabilities or organizations representing individuals with disabilities, participate in the self-evaluation process by submitting comments. So allowing interested individuals to look at what you're doing with regard to creation of your self-evaluation and the performance and the creation of your transition plan. A lot of times, you know, we're looking at it with different eyes. We don't necessarily, you know, look at it from the perspective of someone who has to deal with a disability every day. And it's not on purpose. It's not meant to exclude. It's just human nature. We just don't think about it. So yes, so why involve the public?
That's just an open-ended question. It
Yeah,
doesn't.
and I think I just answered mine. No, but I mean, it really, it is very critical, yes.
Yeah, we wanted to stress this because in my experience with the few municipality reviews that I have done and the ones that we have done together, this seems to be one of the things that really is the easiest thing to do. That seems to be the one thing that people don't do. So we want to make sure that you're taking this as part of, and you should know this from anything that you do within your city, anything that you do within your city. If you're going to create a sidewalk plan, if you're going to create any kind of plan for the city, you typically have to have community involvement somehow or another. So that's all this is. And we're trying to emphasize that you involve the right kind of, the right part of your community as well as anybody in general. So just making sure that most cities have a mayor's committee for people with disabilities. There are usually statewide independent living centers that work with people with disabilities. Any organization that works with people with disabilities should be able to tell you how to get in touch with, you know, the local organization or the grassroots organizations of people with disabilities. We just want to make sure that you do put that out there, that you get them to review your plans, that you get feedback from them, and you make sure that you keep that as part of your self-evaluation.
So did you have a question?
Mark pretty much answered it, but in addition to that, that's something we're doing a transition plan. We need to put it out in paper or
Yes.
on radio or on
Yes, and yes.
communication.
Again, the question is how do we get this out? How do you as a municipality get this out to your community? It's going to depend on what works best for your community. When we were doing ours, we had a list of, I want to say about 40 disability organizations across the state, and really our transition plan is a statewide plan. So we sent out the draft plan to all of those organizations and asked for feedback. That could be something that you do. We've just recently seen the city of Raleigh advertise a public meeting for people to come in and talk to the people that worked on their plan and pulled it together to give feedback. You know, you can just put it out there for review and ask for feedback. You can hold public meetings in anything that you feel like is going to work best in your community.
But as far as your advertisement for your public meetings, just again, just a reminder to be mindful of your effective communication with all members of the, you know, the public. You know, a solely audible reminder isn't going to help everyone that might need it. So that's just try to get as broad a cross section as you can. I think it's the best method to take there.
Can we get a list of those agencies that Mark was talking about?
Absolutely. There's a, I can, I don't have it on me, but I can email it to you. If anybody needs my card or my contact information, you know, during the break, please let me know. But I can get a copy of helpful contacts for you.
I think there was, did you have a question?
I'm sorry.
Related to getting the word out, you mentioned contacting organizations who represent those with disabilities. Would it suffice it to put it out like in the newspaper, the website, and on radio, and not actually target those organizations, or those organizations need to be contacted directly?
My recommendation would be that you at least try and make an effort. Now, there may not be any, and you know, if you're in a very small municipality and there may not be any. I would at least try and make an effort and just keep records of those efforts. If you've just gotten to the point where you just don't see any, there aren't any organizations or anything like that, then yeah, just advertising it in general to the community would suffice.
Yeah, it boils down to due diligence. Just again, you know, doing everything you can to make sure everyone's involved. This is just more about public input. You do have to get the word out to the public, put the word out to the disability community. Again, many municipalities have mayor's committees for persons with disabilities. Those that don't would contact any local or maybe even regional disability organizations. Use print and electronic media, use radio and broadcast television. I mean, do what you can to really to do everything to get the information out. And in order to verify that you actually did get or did what you could, again, used your due diligence, keep minutes from any meetings you may have with the public. Keep all correspondence, emails, that sort of thing, you know, talking about, you know, getting people to the meetings, talking about questions, all of your correspondence. Keep a record of attendance at the meeting. That's actually very helpful. And keep a list of all individuals who were consulted, whether they attended meetings or not, just so that you can show as much as you possibly can that you involve the public as much as you possibly could. So does anybody have any questions up to now?
That's the end of our presentation.
The procedure that you use. Do you self-evaluation plan again?
No, you need to get public input on, well,
and we probably learned from our mistake. We did just that, what you said. And the question was, do you go ahead and do the self-evaluation and put it out for review? It really, there is no requirement one way or the other. What you're trying to get feedback on is what areas of the city do we really need to focus on. You know, that can happen after the self-evaluation is done. It's probably going to serve you best to have something in draft form to show people for them to review. Otherwise, you may not get the kind of feedback that you need. That was our belief, and it was approved, so we were fine with that process.
That's what I was thinking about, because at this point in time, we don't really have any idea.
Yeah, what I would suggest is if you're in a city like Greensboro, like Winston-Salem, like Charlotte, a larger city that has these well-established community groups like mayor's committees for people with disabilities, it probably wouldn't hurt you to send a representative to one of their meetings and ask to get on their agenda. Let them know that you're starting this process, and if anybody has any feedback about city services, about city facilities, about city pedestrian rights of way, or sidewalks, to give them a contact to call so that they can let you know of a particular problem area of the city that may get overlooked somehow or another. So that, I would recommend that in that form. Otherwise, if you send out a draft after the fact, I think that's just as acceptable.
I mean, you've got a plan and you're, just trying to update it. You don't have to go through this whole process again, do you?
Well,
Contacting the public and getting all these people involved. I mean,
well, strictly speaking, strictly speaking, from the standpoint of the statute, you should probably get public input. If anything have we overlooked anything? Has anything come up since that time? Or we got a new building we didn't think about. The public can be incredibly useful because they're just looking at it with a different pair of eyes. So I feel like that is something you're going to want to do.
And we've not really ever had this come up and had this question specifically. I might have a little bit different take on it in terms of what's actually required, because the only requirement is that you establish a plan for addressing and updating your plan. It doesn't say in that you have to get public feedback every time that you do it, at least not to my knowledge. Now, Ashley has done a lot more research than I have. But I would say just for good community involvement, I mean, you're going to want to try every 3 or 5 years when you decide that you're going to, whatever system that you're going to set in place to get your transition plan updated, you probably want to involve the community, just like you would with any other plan that you set forth in your city.
Yeah, I'm just coming at it from kind of a always cover your bases standpoint, but I guess that's where I come from. I come different. Are there any other questions or anything? Okay, well, we're going to take a little break. While we do that, I'm going to leave a copy. I'm going to leave our transition plan out here. Anybody that wants to take a look at it. Again, there are paper copies of the slide presentation. We have more to come. And also, if I'm not available, here's some of my cards. If you guys need any information or want to talk to me about anything, please give me a call.
There will be
nuts and bolts specifications of the ADA requirements. How high does the rail have to be? How wide does the door have to be? That type of thing. That checklist we were talking about from the Greensboro contingent over here, that can be found at adachecklist.org. So copy that down. That's going to be a very useful resource for you. I also wrote a little more neatly accessboard.gov and then ada.gov. All of those are excellent resources, and they have your contact information if you prefer a warm body to a website. They're happy to talk to you. They want you, they want you in compliance as much as you want to be in compliance. So one final thing, a gentleman over here somewhere, I think, it made a very excellent point during the break as far as doing your self-evaluations of facilities. He said, well, what about the facilities where the public doesn't go, like pump stations and water plants and that type of thing? No, you don't have to do a self-evaluation on that facility if the public doesn't go. However, you aren't necessarily negated from having to do an evaluation on that facility at all if you have an employee who may have a need, and you have to look at it from that standpoint. So you do have a responsibility to make it ADA compliant for your employees, but not necessarily the public. Are there any questions before I turn this over to Mark? You don't have to listen to me.
I have a quick question about
Yes.
So our facility, they do tours like for school kids. So I'm assuming wherever that tour goes, that would have to be.
If the public goes in it, yeah, you're going to want to do that.
Okay.
Any other questions? Okay.
Also, just to follow up during the break, one of our highway divisions is actually located in this building, and he came in to introduce himself and to talk to me a little bit. And the one thing he pointed out that I hadn't really thought about, we had the discussion, I think it was from somewhere over here, in terms of state roads and your local roads and who's responsible for the curb ramp. And what I said was that if it's a state road, it's going to be in our inventory. Those curb ramps that are on those state roads will be in our inventory. The one thing that he asked me to make sure that I point out is if you come in as part of some work that you're doing, putting in new water pipes, sewage lines, whatever the case may be, and you tear up your sidewalk and you tear up your curb ramp or that curb ramp, then it's your responsibility to put that curb ramp back to the way, or not back to the way it was, but because if it was not compliant, you now need to put it back into a compliant form. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Any questions before we move on? You don't have to listen to Ashley anymore, but you do get to listen to me. Okay. All right, so what now? So we've gone through the process this morning of doing a self-evaluation. You pulled this group of employees together, and we didn't really talk a whole lot about that, but I'll say you can pull together any number of employees. This doesn't have to be a daunting task for one or two people. You know, you can assign a responsibility to every person, one person in every department throughout your city. So if you've got a person that's in Parks and Recs that you want to make them responsible for, you put them through some training for doing the evaluation of all the Park and Recs facilities, then you can do that. You can spread the load out, let everybody get involved. So, and that's a way to do it. And that's the way we did our original facility inventory. So there are any number of ways to do that. So now you've done that, you've got the self-evaluation done, you've checked all your facilities, you know which facilities have problems, you've identified the deficiencies. What's next?
Create an action plan.
Create an action plan, exactly. And that's exactly what a transition plan is. I can get this thing. Okay, so thank you for saying that, because that's exactly what I needed to hear. So what you've done is you've gone through, you've created these inventories, you've got these wonderful reams and reams of paper or electronic, however you got it, that show all of these buildings. It shows what you measured, what you checked. It shows what you found that's not in compliance, what's deficient. And then you've got to determine, okay, so now I know what the problems are. What do I do next? So that's what the transition plan. The transition plan is basically your action plan. It is to lay out a plan on how you're going to address all of the deficiencies that you found during your self-evaluation. You can't have one without the other. That's what Ashley was talking about earlier when she said the self-evaluation is basically your foundation for your transition plan. This is both of our documents in one sort of, one plan. Everything's all together. We break it down so that the self-evaluation plan is kind of first, and then it goes into the transition plan. So that's what you're looking at. It's very logical. I mean, if you can just think about it in terms of, okay, we've looked at this house that we're building, and we've determined, no, the sink is too low, the faucets are not the right faucets, the bathroom's perfect, everything's perfect in the bathroom. That's on our list, but it's perfect. You know, the stairs outside are too steep. So you've got this list now of the things that you have identified that need to be fixed. Every weekend, everybody does this. You do a self-evaluation of what you're going to do over the weekend. You you create a transition plan for what you're going to do that weekend to get those things accomplished. Simple, right? You should be able to do this in a matter of a couple days, right? So basically, at minimum, you should have an inventory of the facilities indicating the deficiencies that you found, any obstacles, any problems. A detailed description of how you're going to make those facilities accessible, what you're going to use. So we'll talk about it in a little bit, a couple slides down the road in terms of the different accessibility guidelines that you would use to go through your self-evaluation process and then use those same guidelines for fixing the problems that you found. So a detailed plan and schedule for doing the work to make the facilities accessible. And then the other minimal thing that you have to have is the name of the person that's going to be responsible for carrying out this plan. Okay. The other thing that your plan has to state is who your ADA coordinator was. How many of you, I know some of you raised your hand, who's an ADA coordinator? Let's hold your hands up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So 9 out of what, 70, 75 people? Okay. So how much more work did you get as an ADA coordinator that you didn't have before? I heard lots. Does anybody have the role of ADA coordinator and that's their only responsibility is to be that city's ADA coordinator? Nobody. Everybody has other duties. Am I hearing, is that right? Okay. Fortunately, when I first started, now it's changed since I started, but I was NCDOT's ADA coordinator, and that was my only responsibility. Now, keep in mind, that's a huge responsibility for the Department of Transportation, but it was a sole focus. That has kind of changed since I've been there for 4 years, and we've added other duties. But we have an ADA program, so that's a good thing. So we have a focus in that program. So the ADA coordinator is basically you're going to be your public contact person. So any person in the public that needs some accessibility or has an accessibility issue, you want to have a point of contact for the public, and that would be your ADA coordinator. And it's going to be obviously your ADA coordinator's responsibility to work with the group of people that have done the self-evaluation, making sure that they're staying on track, making sure that they're looking at everything that they need to look at. As the ADA coordinator, that would be kind of their focus. ADA position statement. We passed out, I don't remember, does anybody have, did we pass out the position statement? Yes, this one-page letter signed by the Secretary of the Department of Transportation. This was approved by FHWA, so it is approved by a federal entity. So it can be an example of a position statement that you would use. We also have, I go the right way, a couple of other examples, other cities that have them on their websites that you can look at if you have yet to create a position statement. Basically, the position statement is there to talk about how you look at the ADA within your municipality, how you make your services accessible, who to contact if there's an issue, you know, all of that. It's just basic contact, basic policy statements of your responsibility with the ADA for your municipality. Does anybody have any questions after reading over the policy statement? It's pretty straightforward. The other document that we gave you was NCDOT's grievance process. This is required. The municipality must have an ADA complaint or grievance process. You have to have in place a process for somebody to file a grievance or complaint in terms of the ADA. We originally, and if you go online when you get home, or if you already have, if you look at our transition plan, you're actually going to see a different grievance process in our transition plan than the one that we've given you today. That's because about a year after we created the original one, or a year or two, we were asked to make a couple of changes. We originally were giving them 60 days to file the grievance from the actual incident, and we've expanded that to be more in line with all federal requirements, and that's 180 days to file the grievance. So that was one of the minor changes that we made, but there were several changes that we made. So this is the newer and the actual grievance plan that we use, and it's what's online.
For both employees and civilians?
No, this is just for civilians. Okay. We have, I think on our website, we also have the link for employees. I don't know that you would have access to it because I think it goes to an internal website for employees. I would recommend that you work with your HR department. I would imagine that your HR department already has some sort of grievance process established for employees. Any questions so far? Y'all got quiet after the break. Y'all ready to get out of here? Okay, so just so that we're kind of clear, we are going to go over this checklist. If any of you have talked with Ashley and have sort of begun that review process, This is the checklist. It's a one-page, simple checklist that we use when we come out to do a review. A lot of these questions that you're seeing as I go through this transition process are questions on this checklist. So that's kind of why things are phrased the way they are. But we are going to go through this checklist real quick after we're complete so that we have a clear understanding for everybody. And basically, all of these come directly out of regulation. So we looked at the CFR, we looked at what it was asking for, and we made sure that it was on this list, and that's all it is. So basically, in the transition plan, you have to show that you've got a record of some sort of having done a self-evaluation and that you've done the evaluation of the services, policies, and procedures, as well as all of the inventories and everything else that comes with that. And as I said, our document has everything. One of the things that we decided to do, and it really wasn't us deciding to do it, it's what we were told to do. We put everything in one document because we wanted to make sure that if anybody came and they wanted to say, we want to see your self-evaluation or your transition plan, we wanted an easy way to be able to do that. We have this document on our website. It's two files. It's the actual plan plus the appendices. But we've got everything in one place, so we can pull this out and it's done. We're actually in the process, or we will be in the process this year of doing our update for this. And as we do that update, we'll create a new document. So one of the things that we would stress that's going to make it easier for you, and we're trying to give you tips of how to best move forward, is one of the things that we run into is we come to a city and we arrive and there's about 10 notebooks piled all over the conference room table that we have to go through and look through every little thing. And there's nothing wrong with that, except when you have your first person that comes in, to the information desk and says, I'd like to see your city's ADA transition plan. So you're going to have to figure out how you're going to deal with that. So the more concise that you can get this transition plan into one document, or the least number of documents, the better off you're going to be. And we talked about the ADA coordinator. So is there a clear designation of the person responsible for the plan? That can be the ADA coordinator, but it does not have to be the ADA coordinator. Anybody give me an example of when you think it would not be, or other ways to who that would be? It could be your city manager. It could be, typically you want this to be somebody in a position of authority so that they can make sure that the plan is carried out the way you have laid it out. So it's the ADA coordinator is kind of in the weeds and doing all the work to make sure that everything gets done, but then you need somebody in authority to make sure that the plan gets done. If I remember correctly, I believe our plan says that I'm the one responsible for that, but I have, through my boss, direct access to the Secretary of the Department of Transportation to get that done. So it's been 4 years, so I can't remember if it's me or if it's the Secretary, so it's one or the other. Any questions about that? And this is basically what I've already said. Making sure that your evaluation, your transition plan are available for public inspection. Making sure that it is available to anyone that asks for it. Now that could ultimately mean that if you get asked, you may have to put it in some sort of alternative format. Large print, Braille, it could be any number of things that you may be asked to do. Text only documents, yeah, anything like that. And the best practice and what we've chosen to do is just make sure that it's on your website. And that way you can refer anybody internally or externally to it.
But it's not accessible unless it's out there in two formats.
Right. So the point is that if you've got it on your website, it's got to be accessible because, all of the IT requirements and things like that. And if you've got a document that has PDFs and all of that built into it, some of those things are not going to be accessible to screen readers for those with visual disabilities. So you've got to make sure that it's in the correct format and accessible to anyone that needs it.
What about languages?
Languages, that would not have anything to do with the ADA. That goes into your LEP requirements under Title VI. And yes, you would be required to do that, but that's something totally separate.
Does the plan need to be on website or instructions as to how to get it?
You could do either one. I would say either one would be accessible. If you have a plan, especially if you're working with an old document that is in several binders or something like that, if you just don't have it so that it can be put on the website easily, as long as you give some sort of instruction on how to obtain it, I would say that that would be acceptable and accessible. Okay. Any other questions? Y'all are in a hurry to get out of here, aren't you? And this is a lot of what you're going to see over the next few slides are things to make our lives or Ashley's life a little bit easier when we're coming and doing reviews at some point when that happens.
It will also make your life easier if my life is easier, I will say that.
So we are looking for something that's really cohesive, that it's put together. It's going to make it all around, like Ashley says, it's going to make your life easier and our life easier if things are just readily available. Now, the process is, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we provide you with this checklist before we come. We give you every opportunity to pull up all of your information together. We're not just going to show up one day and ask you to start pulling things out. We're giving you plenty of advance notice and letting you know what we're looking for. So a lot of times it may be that we don't even have to come on site and do a visit. We can get all of that information before we even need to come out.
I missed the first part of it.
You missed the first part of that.
Yeah, when you started talking about when you come out.
We'll get to that.
We will. We'll cover that just in a few slides.
It's just his friendly face, that's all you said.
Okay, so we're gonna talk about this again because this is very important. So when you did your self-evaluation, you came up with these inventories. You got your inventories of your vertical field facilities, which your administration buildings, your museums, your community centers, all of the things that we asked y'all about when we were beginning our presentation. So you got that inventory, and then you also got an inventory of all of your pedestrian facilities, which we've also covered. Again, that's your sidewalks, your crosswalks, your curb ramps, all of that information. So those are the two biggest inventories. Those will probably end up being the largest components of this self-evaluation and transition plan that you'll have. Now, one thing that I will say with this, now if you're in a smaller municipality, it may not be as much of an issue, but when we're talking about 84,000 curb ramps, when we did our first transition plan, it was manually. We had people on the ground, walking, looking at each one of these things and documenting it on a piece of paper. And that's why we have this nice little pretty inventory that we can print out. But if you've got a GIS inventory, and that's how your inventory is based, it's not as easy as we've seen with a couple of cities where we've come out and looked at these things. So, we've gotten these huge printouts of your city with dots all over the map that show the locations and things like that. And it's one color for if it's compliant, it's another color if it's not compliant. I'm not a GIS expert. I don't know how those systems work. I don't know if those systems can easily produce just a list, a text list of those things. Some of them can, some of them may not be able to, I'm not sure. So whatever your inventory, whatever form it takes, as long as you have the inventory, that's going to be the most important thing. We're not coming in to look at every single curb ramp to make sure that you looked at every single curb ramp in your city. We just want to see that you have what appears to be a comprehensive inventory. Same for your vertical facilities. Now, I will say that when I was doing the reviews and now that Ashley's doing them, one of the processes that we do is, when we start looking and talking to you, we may go and look at your website to see what city services you offer, to see if you have a Parks and Recs department, to see if you have museums, to see if you are responsible for parking decks, all of those little things to make sure that when we do and go and look at your facilities inventories that we're seeing that everything is captured that we saw in types of services that you offer. There was a question over here.
When y'all did your inventory of your sidewalk, how did you?
Curb ramps.
Curb ramp.
We didn't do sidewalks.
How did you address where topography prevents you from having an ADA accessible road?
That is a good question, and I'll be honest with you, I don't know the answer to it, but I can get it for you. I'm gonna assume that it was built into, there was a list of, I can't remember exactly how many things that they looked for when they went out and did this, but I do know that with the new GIS inventory, it's being handled in a different way. So I don't have that answer for you, but I can certainly get it for you. If you'll come up and see me afterwards, I'll make sure I get that for you. Any other questions?
Again, I asked a question, I guess, before, 1992 seems to be a magical date.
That was with the, Donna, do you know the specific dates? For some reason, in I've just drawn a blank. I know that the ADA was established in 90, it was signed into law in 92. And I want to say that all the transition plans, all that whole process had to be done by 96. Is for some reason the year that stands out in my mind.
Well, the reason I brought that up, a lot of people have older buildings. And if you evaluate those older buildings, obviously they're not, a lot of them are not going to be compliant.
If you can show that that building, since you did your original transition plan, or since 1990, whatever, 6, if you can show that that building has not been touched, has not been renovated, has had no improvements to it whatsoever, then it's my understanding, and again, I'm not going to claim to be the expert here, that would be this access board people, but it's my understanding that that would fall under that grandfather type clause, because it's when you have an older building that you start doing renovations, that's the point at which a building becomes required to be current.
Is that any type of renovation? As in adding partition walls, as in taking down partition walls, that type of thing?
If it has to be re.
That's going to be this, because there are certain levels of types of renovation, you know, pulling up a tile square in the bathroom and replacing it. I'm going to guess is no, but I'm not going to answer because I honestly don't know.
But there around the 2010 mark, the DOJ put a major focus on, you can continue to say, this building is inaccessible, but you better not hold programs and services there. You gotta move them. So, I mean, you can continue that thought process, but you just can't use it to provide services out of.
Well, and that's going to be the bottom line, because I mean, and what she's saying is that you can have an old building, you can have an old warehouse in downtown that you may have offices in, but they still have to be accessible to the public. If they're open to the public, you're going to have to make them accessible. You've got to make a way for a person to be able to get into them, if that's what the purpose of the building is.
Or move the program or service.
Right, or move the program or service.
Say the key like the water treatment plant or wastewater treatment plant is just not like accessible.
If they are not open to the public, they are not buildings that the public would go into, then they do not have to be part of this process. This process. Now, we've had this discussion with a few people during the break. What you do need to look at is when you have employees, then you're going to get into a different realm of requirements.
So as carriers of Cheryl's property liability insurance, if an employee is in a serious accident and is now paralyzed, but is still capable of doing his or her job, and I work in your water plant, I've got to have access to that water.
But at the same time, they could be transferred to another position that equals all.
Oh.
As carriers of charitable liability, I would say, please call me. And I'll call Heather with HR.
If the employee was willing to do that.
You know, if it's a preferable move for the employee and the employee says, that'd be great, I love it.
That's what I'm saying.
But when the employee says, I like working in the water plant, it's quiet, it's clean, and I don't have to deal with people, and that's where I want to be.
Does not fall under reasonable accommodation or undue cost?
It is reasonable accommodation. However,
To the employer.
that's why I said, call me, call Heather, and before
There's a
before you
there's a
say we're
fine
not
line
doing
right
that.
there where you're
Yeah.
going with that.
Yeah, before you say we're not doing that, call it some reason.
But you would need to make accessible those areas that their job would require they have access to. Not, you wouldn't have to make it for the entire plant.
Well, if an employee, yes, and the question is, if you have an employee that's disabled that works in a specific building, do you have to make the entire building accessible or just the parts of that building that the employee goes to? Again, I think somebody said a fine line that you're creating there. You know, there could be situations where any other employee might have to go over here to deliver something and you choose not to have this employee because they're disabled, then you get into a sort of a discriminatory practice. I mean, you know, let me preface all this by saying that we don't include anything with employees. We don't look at any of that for this. This is not what we're looking at. That gets into a whole realm of different things. When you're talking about reasonable accommodations, you're talking about undue burden. I mean, all of those things are very different. And, you know, that's a big HR issue, and that's who you need to talk to.
On that, you would go down a whole different ADA road, and it's called the interactive process, and it's on the employment side. And it's a whole other process.
And some of you may be responsible. I don't know, and I'm not going to bother to ask, but I, as the ADA coordinator for NCDOT, also have that responsibility. That is part of what I do. I work with employees and make sure that they get the reasonable accommodations they need. If any employee, all 10,000 employees in NCDOT, if they have a reasonable accommodation request, it comes to me. And you will see somebody pointed out and asked the question in this transition plan. If you look at it, we have that process outlined in this plan. If I were to do this again, I'm not sure that I would include that in here, but it is there. So our employee reasonable accommodation process is outlined in our self-evaluation and transition plan. But she's right. That becomes a very different process. You know, the types of accessibility that you're looking at are pretty much the same, but the ways you go about getting there it's a very different process. Okay. Any other questions? Back to inventories. Any questions about what would be considered a facility that you would look at, pedestrian, any types of questions about policies, services that you would look at, any questions about any of that?
Mark, I have one more question. I do have a question on public parks where we have greenways and walking trails that are not asphalt. So we've got a lot of those who just go to that.
I'm sorry, but honestly, they're going to be the best people to tell you what those types, because when you get into greenways, when you get into walking paths and all of that kind of stuff, it's even a different set of rules and requirements. So you're better off going here so that they can point you in the right direction for that.
We do have complaints that come in periodically for those that are ADA.
Right.
Saying, hey, I can't get there. You know, so we're.
And NCDOT doesn't, we have a bike ped division, but they primarily work with local municipalities and local entities to have those things in place, and we provide funding. So it's just not something that I'm very familiar with at all, and I just don't have the background to even begin to pretend like I can answer your question. So, but they will. They're in this, I think, isn't that covered in that checklist? Is that part of that checklist? No? Okay. They will be able to point you in the right direction for where you can find all that information.
But it should probably be a part of that transition.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Very good.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, any pedestrian facility, so anything that you provide to anybody in your community, whether it's a sidewalk on Main Street, whether it's a park that the kids can go and play at that has a walking trail through it, anything like that's accessible to anybody in the community has to be accessible to a person with a disability. So it has to be part of this transition, this inventory. Okay?
Do y'all do any kind of inventory with North Carolina State or Parks and Rec or North Carolina? Any kind of state parks or anything like that? Y'all just overseeing municipality.
That's correct. Each one of our sister agencies, and that would be Cultural Resources, I believe.
Right.
which should have their own ADA coordinator, and they should be doing the same thing that I'm doing for NCDOT. So if they, and I don't know, I don't know how this works, but if they have a park that's in your municipality, I would think it's a state park, so it's under their purview, so they would be the ones responsible for making it accessible. And if you're trying to get to that you have issues with something like that in your area, then you obviously would need to talk to Cultural Resources to find out who their ADA coordinator is or who you would talk to make sure those things are accessible. That answer your question?
No, it does.
And the question was, to repeat it in case the video didn't catch it, is state parks and parks throughout the state, if what agency would be responsible for those, and that would be Department of Cultural Resources within state government. Any other questions? Any vertical or pedestrian facility that we have not mentioned today that somebody has thought of that might help your fellow municipality? What's an unusual, somebody come up with an unusual facility that you might have to inventory because it is accessible. One thing, and I believe it was the gentleman, somebody over here mentioned earlier, you know, we talked about the facilities that are open to the public. So if you've got a water treatment plant that is not typically open to the public, but say you offer tours for school kids, and those kids can go through your water treatment plant to see how a water treatment plant works. It then becomes accessible to the public. And it is a public access point, and it would have to be part of this.
Fire stations.
Fire stations.
Where the restrooms are back, you know, more with the sleeping quarters or whatever. That's one that I'm struggling with right now. They're really not open to the public.
Right. And that's the question was, or the statement was, fire stations. You know, we all, you have tours, you bring school kids into see the fire station. You know, if you've got restrooms that are in the fire station, but they're part of the fire station is not typically open to the public. There may be a component of the fire station that's open, but the entire facility is not open. And Donna says that that's something that she's struggling with now. I would think that would be something for the access board to sort of help you with. My guess, and again, it's just a guess, would be that there can be part of a facility that's accessible to the public, but there's part of the facility that it's not. So we would have to look at that. Okay.
Also with police stations. I've come across that as well. And just one quick side note, when you're doing your employee count, fire and police do count towards your employees. I did remember that after you mentioned it.
Probably stupid with a press box at a ball field.
A press box at a ball field.
I can answer that. We have a press box, multi-story. And when the feds came in and did an assessment of the school system, they determined that because of the height of our press box, we were the only one in the county that had to have another. So it depends upon the height of the highest elevation of the floor that someone could have access to.
So you can either refer to the access board or to this gentleman over here. I mean, when you've had a visit like that and you've been told to do that, there's obviously a reason for it. I'm sure if he were to follow up with the access board, they would most likely tell him the same thing. Any other questions?
How about like recycling, refuse, transfer stations for trash?
Well, it's public access, so it's going to have to be accessible. Now, what that accessibility looks like for a public refuse or recycle station.
I'm thinking about like lowering a railing to make it more accessible, but then you're creating a hazard for someone that's standing.
Yeah, I mean, so many of those things look different in each municipality, so that's going to have to go to the access board because you're going to have to describe what your specific situation is in your municipality, how that's handled. It could be, you know, some, the ones that I'm thinking of, you just see the green bins and they're all labeled, you know, this is where plastic goes, or this is where glass goes, as long as that's the right height so that somebody can reach it with their wheelchair. But then you get into the pavement, or, I mean, there's all sorts of things that you would start looking at with that. But again, if it's public access, if it's there for the public, then it's gonna have to be accessible in some way. Anything else? Okay. I'm going backwards. Okay. So once you've got all of that in place, this is going to be the next key and the next important part of your process. You've gone through your self-evaluation. You've evaluated all your facilities, pedestrian, vertical, whatever the case may be. You've got these inventories. Part of your inventory shows which facilities and what part of that facility is deficient. So now you need to, in your transition plan, you need to come up with that plan for how you're going to address those deficient issues. There can be a number of ways that you do this. You can look at it in a priority way, meaning the high traffic areas, the things that the public accesses the most, would obviously want to be the things that you would need to focus on first. For NCDOT, can you imagine what that is? Restrooms. For NCDOT, look at all the services that we provide. So one of the things is obviously curb ramps, because those are curb ramps throughout the state. Everybody uses those every day. So we have a process and a plan in place to address all of those. What's another big service that NCDOT provides? Rest stops is a good one. That's another public facility that's high traffic that we want to focus on. How about DMV? That's a fun word these days, isn't it? Okay, so DMV is our most public facing service. So we focus heavily on our DMV offices. All of the offices where you go to get your license, your driver's license, any type of license is owned by the state. And we make sure through assessments and addressing those as quickly as we can that those facilities are accessible. Now, we also have the license plate agencies, which are contractors. I don't know if you know this or not, but a license plate agency is not, they are not run by state employees, they're run by contractors. They are a contractor of NCDOT, and it is therefore still NCDOT's responsibility to make sure that those facilities are accessible. So we go through those facilities just like we do any other facilities. And that's a point to make that we really haven't made at this point, is if you have facilities, if you have services that you're leasing a building for, you know, it's ultimately your responsibility to make sure that that building is accessible. Okay? Any contractor that you have out there that provides city services to the public, you have to make sure that those services are accessible as well as the facilities that the services are provided in.
May I ask you a question about that? So if you have city-owned property that is leased to a private entity, the building is still responsible.
The city ultimately will be, because in the other example that I gave, when we lease a facility, we are responsible ultimately, but we make sure that responsibility then falls on our leaseor, or whatever that's called. Is that the right word? Leaseor. Okay. So in that sense, because you're the owner of the property and somebody else is leasing it and they provide public facing services, then they're going to come back to you and say, we, as part of our, hopefully part of your lease or whatever, they've set it up that way. Okay. Any other questions about any of that? So making sure that you have the list of deficiencies. You can look at it in priority order. Like I was talking about, the DMV offices was one of our highest priorities. Our curb ramps were a high priority. You know, our supply sheds out back at our DMV field offices, those are not high priority issues. Some of them may not even be public access points. So making sure that you have some sort of plan set up and a schedule for when you plan on addressing those deficiencies that you have found. Well, it does not have to be fixed overnight. That's the thing I think out of all of this that you all were waiting to hear, and I think it's a time frame. We can't give you a time frame. I mean, technically, if you look at the regulation, it's already past due. It was already supposed to be done. You know, that's what we're all facing at this point. It's something that was required 20 years ago. What we're saying is that you need to make the effort and you need to show the effort that you've done the self-evaluation, that you have these inventories in place, and that you have a plan. That is one of the things that we have been asked repeatedly to come up with, and that's provide updates on how we have addressed the curb ramps in our facilities when we give our annual report to FHWA, Federal Highway Administration. So annually, we give them a number of curb ramps that we have addressed. So we look at that on a regular basis. So you're going to have to be prepared to come up with that information on a regular basis, as long as you have a plan. Now, I can't tell you it's okay to have a 10-year plan versus a 5-year plan versus a 50-year plan. I can't tell you that. You and your city, your city council, whoever it is that makes those decisions is going to have to come up with the best feasible alternative for your municipality and what's going to work best within your budget, within your requirements, whatever it is that you've got is what you're going to have to determine. Okay, so
as long as we determine that, then DOT's okay with it.
As long as we see that you have a schedule in place, yes. Sir, you said who did you say came out? DOJ?
There was a complaint filed by a student about access to an athletic facility.
Okay.
With the county school system.
Okay.
And that brought the agency that is over that out to do an inspection.
Okay.
Which they didn't just stop at where the complaint was signed. They went throughout the entire system.
Okay. And do you remember them saying anything to you about a plan or your schedule for getting things fixed? Do they give you any?
We weren't involved in it. The only involvement I have is running the clock and marking football.
Okay. All right. I think you're going to have, if you're faced with a visit from the feds, from DOJ, from any of these organizations out here that do this type of thing, you know, you're probably going to get some push to get things done as quickly as possible. They're not going to be too thrilled with a 50-year plan, would be my guess. They're probably not going to be too thrilled with a 20-year plan. Our transition plan, I think, with resurfacing and additional funds, I want to say it was about a 10-year process that it was going to take for those 8,000 some odd curb ramps that we had in our inventory that were deficient. And there was a little bit of pushback on that. So we have ramped that up. We've focused different funds on that. So we're trying to get it done as quickly as possible, as well as we've decided to redo the inventory to make sure that we've captured everything correctly. Okay. So just make sure that it's detailed. So, you know, in your inventories, you need to account for anything that's deficient, show the deficiency, show what was, I mean, if you've got a restroom that doesn't have a handicap stall, it's not the right measurements, those are the types of things that you need to document. So eventually you're going to have facilities guys that can tell you the cost of getting these things fixed. Cost estimates are going to get involved. You're going to show all of those things in your transition plan and come up with a plan for addressing what you can address with this current year budget, next year's budget, how much you're going to set aside in subsequent budgets. So that's all things that we have seen in transition plans thus far.
And that you include everything in your inventory, not just what is.
Right. And the other key, and we've kind of been saying this all along, the inventory is not just an inventory of the deficient facilities or the deficiencies within that facility. The inventories are all of your facilities. So if you've got one building that was built last week and was open last week and is brand new, and you believe that everything in there is perfectly accessible, and you believe that in your heart of hearts, then that still needs to be on your inventory, but as a building that's fully accessible. Okay. So a lot of this is the description of the methods. Ashley and I have had this sort of discussion back and forth. This is one of the areas that's a little bit vague, and you're not sure what they're talking about when they say a description of the methods to make your facilities accessible. So you kind of have to look at it as a whole sphere of things and not just one specific thing. You're looking at how you plan to work on your schedule to address the accessibility issues. You've got to state what guidelines you're using. There are 2010 ADA accessibility guidelines. There's PROAC, so there are different guidelines that you need to determine as a municipality that you're going to follow, and then follow those throughout your whole process, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. All of that kind of together shows the process, it shows the methods that you're going to use, how you're going to go about this process of making sure that everything is accessible ultimately through your self-evaluation and transition plan.
So if you live or you work in a historical town and everything was laid, all the rock, stonework was laid, hand-laid by Benjamin Franklin. Yes, we do have to have a plan going forward, but I'm gonna have the historical society on my board. So are these websites gonna have a viable solution?
Yeah, and let me make sure that we've been pointing to this website, accessboard.org, but we point to that website because there's a phone number for you to call. There's a phone line, and you're not just looking up information as a resource. You're actually calling someone and getting them on the phone at the Access Board and asking them your specific question, and they give you an answer right then. If they do not know the answer right then, they will get back to you. And I cannot emphasize how important these folks are and how good of a resource this is. And again, just to make this clear, this access-board.gov is not just a site for you to go to look up the answer that you're seeking. There is a phone number, there is a line that you can call, a phone line for you to call to get the answers that you're looking for. And we've called them several times about historical questions, and they have all of that information. So these are the two sort of guidelines that you need to look at when you're trying to determine what accessibility you're look at. And you've got accessibility, Americans with Disabilities Act, accessibility guidelines, ADAG 2010. Make sure you're looking at 2010. That's the most recent update. And then you've got public right-of-way accessibility guidelines, PROAC. How many people have heard of these things? Okay, so how many people have not heard of these things? Okay. All right, so when you're looking at, primarily this is going to be what you're looking at when you're looking at facilities. So when you're looking at buildings, how big does the door, how wide does the door have to be? What type of door handles does it have? All of those types of accessibility guidelines are going to be covered through ADAG, ADAG 2010. When you start looking at sidewalks, some of that is covered in ADAG, but PROAC gets more into that side of it. Public right-of-way accessibility guidelines. So that talks about your public right-of-way. So when we were looking at our curb ramps, we had to make a decision. Okay, which guidelines are we going to follow? And we stick with those guidelines and just go with it. So you have to kind of look at those. Your engineers probably will know more about that, and you can figure out what you're going to stick with and use. Okay. This gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Once you do your transition plan, as I said, we did ours and finished it. It was approved in 2015. And in our document, there's one line I wish I had not included, but I did. It says that we would update it in 3 years. Well, this is 2018, so it's time to update it according to what I said I would do. So we are working on an update to this plan. We will have a new document simply because there are several things that have changed that we'll have to update. There's a component in here about our website. Our website is a brand new website that we put out there about 3 or 4 months ago. So that's a whole different website that we have to approach and look at now. So make sure that you've got a document that you can keep track of. Hopefully it's a document that's going to update itself. If you've got GIS-based curb ramp inventory, those types of things are going to update themselves. So when you do resurfacing, when you do construction work, all of that, it should update itself and be tracked in that way.
You said it was approved by who, by you?
By FHWA.
Oh, okay, so you-
That's who we're responsible to.
Well, when you look at these plans, do you offer suggestions or are they requirements or?
When we come and do our review,
Yes.
is that what you're asking? So when we come and do our review, do we offer suggestions? What do we do? So we're reviewing based on this checklist for the requirements. And if we find that you don't have any of these or one of these is missing, then we help you, we require that you set a corrective action plan to get any missing part of the requirements. And we can work with you on that and sort of help you get through that process. You want to start talking about this or?
Sure.
I'm going to let Ashley come up and talk about our review process because this is really her baby now. And she's done a lot more of these actually now than I have in the 4 years that I've been here.
Okay, so what can you expect from us? Most of you have already gotten through the survey process. We wrote you and we asked you if you had 50 or more employees, who your ADA coordinator was, if you had a transition plan. If you didn't, did you need help with one? And based upon your answers to that, we've contacted you in some form or fashion. Some of you don't have some of you haven't, gotten your self-evaluation transition plan done. You're in the process. We're trying to provide technical assistance. Some of you do have a self-evaluation transition plan, and I'm trying to schedule a time to come out for a visit and make sure everything, meets this checklist right here. Again, technical assistance at any time. I am more than happy to help. If I don't know the answer, I will ask this wonderful person here, or I'll, we can call these. I can get you in touch with someone who knows, or I'll find the answer. So please, I am here to help. Please call me. I will do everything I can to get you in touch with the right person. And then we do have the review process. So once you have developed your transition plan and notified me that you have to have done that, I will send you a letter with this checklist and tell you, if you can send me any documentation evidencing the items on this checklist beforehand, it will greatly streamline the process for both of us. And I wasn't going to mention it, but since Mark went there, you could even avoid a visit from me if you send enough documentation. I need to see everything on here that we've talked about, everything that we've discussed on the slide, and everything that would check off an item on this checklist. And if you'll notice, each item on this checklist has the corresponding statute to it. So if you wanted to go and read and see exactly what we're talking about, a lot of people like to work backward from this list, when gathering their documentation. Does the municipality have 50 or more employees? Check yes or no. If yes, a transition plan is required. Identify the municipality's ADA coordinator by name and title. Check yes or no. Is the coordinator's contact information readily available to the public? That's also very important. Your ADA position statement, I need to see that. If you do have it, is it readily available to all interested parties? Do you have a complaint grievance process? Do you have a record of self-evaluation of services and practices? The base for your transition plan. Do you have a transition plan? Is there a clear designation of the person responsible for the transition plan? Are the self-evaluation and transition plan available for public inspection? Again, this is all stuff that we've talked about, but this is stuff that I have to see. And that's why we're talking about documentation. So that we can just, get through the process and get you compliant. Were interested parties allowed to provide comment and feedback during the self-evaluation process? If yes, is there evidence for that? Like we discussed, public attendance records, that type of thing. Are there inventories of all the municipalities' facilities identifying any existing barriers, intersection information, curb ramps, sidewalks, and other accessibility elements, vertical and pedestrian facilities? I think we've beat that horse pretty thoroughly. Does the municipality have a schedule or plan for removing the barriers? And does the municipality have a clear and detailed description of the methods used to make the facilities available? ADAG or PROAG, basically what we were discussing. If you provide the documentation, or if when I come for a review, if I'm able to check yes, great. If I'm not, then what we were discussing is we'll do everything we can to get you compliant. My job is to write a final report based on my review of the transition plan, and list any deficiencies that may exist at the time of my review. Based upon the deficiencies that I may find, I'll notify you. You have 30 days.
I think it's 60.
I think, yeah.
60.
Yeah, you have 60 days, pardon me, to get me any additional evidence you may have. See if we can.
That is 30.
That is,
Yeah,
that's okay.
that's 30.
Sorry, you're basically, when I send you a copy of my final report, and if there is a deficiency, you have 30 days to get me any additional evidence you may have that we might can clear the problem up. And if we can, great. If not, then you will have an additional 60 days to provide me with a corrective action plan.
Let me make one point about this if I can, because we've had this confusion. When we're saying if we find a deficiency, that doesn't mean if we find that you've got curb ramps that are deficient. That's not what we're talking about.
No.
We're talking about if you didn't meet any of these items on this checklist. For example, you don't have an inventory of your curb ramps, or you don't have a grievance process. If you don't have one of these items on that checklist, that's what we are considering a deficiency. We're not looking, we're not getting into the weeds of it to make sure that you've got every little deficiency listed and that you've got to get all these deficiencies fixed within this corrective action plan that we're talking about. That's a very different process. All we're looking at is our review process and the checklist items, and I think there's 12 in all. So we're looking at 12 items. If you've got all 12 items and you can show us that you've got all 12 items and they're to what they need to be, then you've got a perfect review and you're done. If there are things that you're missing, for example, you don't have one of those inventories, then we work through that process. We ask you to create a corrective action plan for when you can get one of those, that inventory done. So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at our deficiencies.
Yes, exactly. I'm interested in a sheet of paper. I want to be able to check these. I really want to. I really want to check these off positively. Yeah. So then we're pretty much done. Are there any questions based on that?
Are there any fines if they don't get paid in that 60-day period?
Yeah, let's go back to this. The penalties was one of the things up here. We do not have any penalties. I mean, we're not going to issue any penalties. Basically, the way this whole review process works is that when we get done, if we have asked you for a corrective action plan and you provide us that corrective action plan, we will eventually follow up with you at some point down the road to see how that's going. That will be part of our responsibility. We've not really been doing that up to this point because of staffing issues, but we do have a dedicated person that's doing this, and that's what Ashley will be doing, is that follow-up process. Now, one thing that I will add to this, and just full disclosure. So part of your question is, what do we do with this information? So this information is our review. It's what we've done as part of our process. We report annually to the Federal Highway Administration on what we've done this year. And every year since I have been here, we have included the municipality reviews that we have conducted during that year. And that would include everything in that review, meaning the checklist. It shows the corrective action plans that we've gotten. It indicates if a municipality was perfect when we went and did their review. So all of that.
My report.
Right. So all of that information would be included in that report that goes to the Federal Highway Administration. That's all we do. So we're simply trying to make sure that you're not discriminating, and we have gone through that process, and that's what we're trying to do. We will follow up with you after that to make sure that at some point you're following through with the things that you said you would do. And we make that part of any reporting that we do to our responsible entity, and that's FHWA. Start doing reviews. We've been doing it.
I'll do it. Based upon your responses to the surveys, if you've answered that you have a transition plan, I'm getting, you're on the list. I'm getting the response up there.
So for this, I think you answered my question to who we submit it to, we submit it to you, and even when we do the review down the road, we submit it to you, do that checklist again, correct?
Yes, that's, I'd be the point person
Say
for
that
that.
again, okay. So, you want me to?
I think her question was, who does she submit it to once they have it done, and then any corrective action or reviews or that type of thing. I'd be the point person for the municipalities, yes.
And one last question. So you don't need council approval for this? This would just be something my city manager would go ahead and do, correct?
Well, it has to be, the plan has to be, well, I guess it is case specific, but typically they're adopted by the councils in order to get funding to fix the issues. So I think
I mean, now, unless you have found something that says that we are looking for that, I have never looked for that. I've never looked for, to ensure that it's been adopted. I mean, what we are looking for is what we said earlier, is that you have somebody named that is ultimately responsible.
Well, now there have been issues, just to clarify, there have been times where a municipality has hired a private consulting firm. That private consulting firm, based upon that, has filed their self-evaluation report. And all it is, until it's accepted by the city, we can't count it as the city's transition plan. So it does have to be, if there's an instance like that, then yeah, we have dealt with that type of situation before.
What type of time frame starts it? I've spoken with you a couple of times. We're looking at, we're going through the process.
Right.
It's a budgetary process from our standpoint. If we're going to hire an outside agency to come in and evaluate what we've got, it may take them 6 months to come in and do their evaluation. It may take them 8 months. It may take them a year. As long as I tell you, yes, we've got them. Yes, they're coming. Yes, we haven't got it done yet. That's okay. Yeah,
just communicate. Yeah, I just need to, I know it's not going to come together overnight. And if it did, I'd be worried about it because it probably wouldn't be, that good. We want it to be thorough. This is for your protection. When it all boils down to, this is for your protection. So we want it to be as good as you can make it, and that it ain't going to come together overnight. But please do communicate with me. I mean, if there is if you are having to wait on council approval, if you're having to wait on money, if you're having to wait on a private consulting firm, just let me know so that I can just keep a record of where we are in the process, and just bear with me because I've got about 260 that I'm doing, and so I may not remember where everyone is at the same time, but I will have it figured out.
When we responded to the initial mailing.
Yes, sir.
Whether we were going to do it ourselves or get a consultant to do it, was that the notification that you're looking for?
Well, it doesn't really matter to me if you do it yourself or if you get a consultant, as long as the process is moving forward. That's really a personal preference, a municipality preference.
That response covers what you're asking for as far as what are we doing?
Yeah, if you're currently trying to decide, I think what I'm understanding your question is if you're currently trying to decide to be doing it yourself or hiring a public consulting firm, if that's where you are in your process right now, that's where you are in your process. Just if you can just let me, like, maybe we hope to have that decision made by the end of the month. Just throwing something out there, just kind of giving you an idea.
Just to go back to this list that we created in the very beginning, everything that I have checked. Now, if you threw something out and you don't think that we've covered it, if I put a check box or check by it. Yeah.
Or if you thought of something in the meantime.
Yeah. One thing I don't know that we really talked about was samples. I think we touched on it at one point. We've got our transition plan. And to be quite honest with you, when I was going through the process, when I first started with DOT, I just did a Google search, ADA accessibility plans. And for you, I did it for, obviously for DOT agencies, you know, for you, municipality ADA accessibility plans, transition plans.
Do try to be careful about going out of state to look for transition plans. Just to be safe. I will say that I do recommend, and they're up here, so I mean, I don't have a problem saying it. Jacksonville, North Carolina, and Winston-Salem, North Carolina are thus far the two municipalities that have completed transition plan reviews with perfection. So whatever they have posted, they have very, very good websites if you want to take a look at those.
Anything else that we didn't cover? Anything else you thought of?
Could you go over once again, why the big push?
Why the big push?
Constitution. Pretty much.
Simply, this was in 2015 when we did our transition plan. We were made aware that part of our responsibility is to ensure that our subrecipients are not discriminating. And that's the process that we have adopted, and we are moving forward with that process. And the reason that you're seeing the big push this past year, meaning going from the original survey of 20 to 200 and however many, is an increase in staffing, the ability to do it. So we knew that we ultimately had to look at all of the municipalities. And so now we've got that ability to move forward a little bit quicker on that. Just that simple. No order from any other entity that you've got to do this. You've got to do it quicker. It's got to be done by next week. Nothing like that. It's just what we are able to do now. Any other questions?
You guys all have this. You guys have our contact information here. Any questions that you think of afterward, anything you need help with, please feel free to give me a call. Or shoot me an email. And again, these slides will be available through the League of Municipalities as soon as I'm able to get an email to her. So thank you guys. Thank you so much for coming. Just your being here shows that you are committed to this process, and we really, really appreciate that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We as a league would like to thank you all for coming. Don't get up just yet, because I have a couple things I need to say before I say them. I need to cut off the video. All right. Number one, the first thing I wanted to say, because I've heard it a couple of times, are there any penalties? Are there any penalties? Right now, no, it's just trying to get
We
everybody
report it to the
compliant.
Federal Highway Administration.
Your penalty will be when someone with a disability or one of the active public entities that, or not public entities, but citizen groups come out and approach your town and say you are not in compliance and threaten lawsuits, and then you're kind of stuck out there because you've got to get this stuff in place very quickly. So be proactive, do it now with their assistance.
It's kind of like liability insurance.
Yeah.
You cover your buildings against fire because just in case.
So, and speaking of that, going back to Turville's comment about employment, if an employee is injured, or you have somebody that's very highly qualified for that water department position, but they're disabled, can you provide reasonable accommodations? I have many towns here represented, many municipalities, several, or actually a lot of you, the majority of you are participants in our risk pools, whether workers' comp and or the property casualty. Those of you that are in our property casualty with the liability coverage, we do, and Heather jump in if you need to interject, we have a new service now for that purpose. When you have that employee and you're wondering, can I get them in the water plant? Can I move them to a different position? You call up Heather or you call up Hartwell Wright and they will discuss with you. We have a new service now because some of this, we are not ADA experts. That's why we have them here. Can go above and beyond that. And after you speak with Heather, she will. Yes. We'll get you things up with HR comments. And so it depends on if you're in our property and liability. Actually, have to give you up to 5 hours of HR people, which for a lot of towns is very beneficial. We have several towns that are in program now, and we think that it will reduce their claim. So if you're looking at maybe a $20,000 claim, if you interject with an HR firm, you may not have that claim.
So if you think that something's been improved, call me or call Hartwell, let's consult over the phone. And if we can get you to an HR attorney, we will. And also, if you reach out to us, we get you an attorney, you're still sued, your employment liability deductible, if it's $10,000, is reduced to $5,000. So reach out to us. I mean, if I can say anything, call me and let's work through it. And if anything, it's gonna save you $5,000 if you do it, that would be sued even after working with you.
I'll just, if I could just add, because of my responsibility in terms of reasonable accommodation, another good online resource is jan.org, Job Accommodation Network. You can go on there, you can put any type of disability in, and it will give you a list of the accommodations that are possible for that disability. It's just a very good set of, a good resource for that type of thing as well.
So just to reiterate, for those of you in our liability covered schools, if that issue comes up, whether it be ADA or any other kind of employment issue, reach out to Heather, reach out to Hartwell. We have 5 hours free legal consultation, phone consultation for you to help with that. So if you do have that ADA issue come up and you're wondering, can I provide reasonable accommodations or can I relocate this employee? We will help you with that. I also got asked a couple of times during break, does the league have any ADA resources? The simple answer right now is no. That's why I tried to pull this training together, because so many of you called trying to get the information. We have resources here. They have resources for you that they've provided. You feel free to call me anytime you have questions. We are trying to find some preferred providers for municipalities that can assist with the consulting. We're having problems finding people right now, or consulting groups. I may see if you all can recommend anybody that we could contact to ask if they could participate. So we're trying. We're really, I feel like, behind the 8 ball on this because it's been out there for a long time. We should have that resource. So we are trying to find that.
I don't know why I didn't even think about this, but there is another good resource. I don't know if any of you have ever been to, there's a network of ADA resource centers across the country. The Southeastern Center is in Atlanta, I believe, is that correct? But there is also, annually, there is a national ADA symposium, which will give you 500 times more information than you've got today. They will go in, they have workshop presenters that talk about all of those specific, the measurements and the slopes and all of that kind of stuff. And it's an excellent conference. It's offered once a year. It's usually May or June. This year it's, I want to say it's in June this year, and it's right outside of Dallas, Fort Worth, in a little town called Grapevine, Texas. If you go into Google and just put in ADA, National ADA Symposium, it'll take you directly to their website. There's a lot of information that they provide you with there. It's a good resource if you have the funds. The registration is usually around $600 so per person. So, depending on what your funds are, but if you've got the ability to send somebody to that, it's an excellent resource and a good way to find information. We've had several of our municipalities that have gone to that. I know several people in the city of Raleigh have gone, Charlotte, some of the bigger municipalities. Have you ever gone? No, not the national one. They also have regional ones throughout the country. I'm not sure when those are coming up, but definitely the national symposium is a good one.
And other than that, if you registered, which you all did, so when you registered, you inputted your email address. So I already have all that. Everyone registered, I will figure out how to get a mass emailing out to all of you with the PowerPoint presentation. So I'll take care of that. You don't need to get a hold of me to do that. Any other questions, any other need for information, you are more than welcome to email me or Mark or Ashley. Just let us know and we'll do what we can. Thank you all. Please drive safely and take a donut.
Well,
12:03. 12:03.